By 1803, the largest European commanded army on Earth outside Europe, roughly 260,000 men, about twice the size of the British Army of the day, did not answer to a king, a parliament, or a nation. It answered to a company. A private, profit-seeking, shareholder-owned company, run from a modest building in the City of London by a permanent staff so small, 35 clerks, by one count in the 1780s, that the whole head office of the most powerful corporation in history could have fitted on a single omnibus. That company collected the taxes of some 20 million people. It minted its own coin, flew its own flag, ran its own courts, made its own treaties, and fought its own wars. And when it overreached and ran out of money in the summer of 1772, it did not die the way companies die. It was rescued the way states are rescued, with public money, on the argument that its failure would take the country down with it. It was the first corporation in history that was too big to fail, and the bill for saving it helped cost Britain America. This is the story of the East India Company, how a syndicate of Elizabethan merchants accidentally invented the immortal corporation, how a trading firm's clerks ended up conquering a subcontinent, how its bailout lit the fuse of the American Revolution, and how a government spent 80 years slowly swallowing the monster it had chartered. Because every modern argument about corporate power, every bailout, every monopoly hearing, every uneasy question about companies grown larger than the countries that host them, was rehearsed in full 2 centuries before anyone said the words "too big to fail." It begins with spice and a piece of paper. On the 31st of December 1600, the last day of the 16th century, Queen Elizabeth I put her seal to a royal charter for 218 London merchants, calling themselves the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies. The charter granted them a monopoly on all English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope, half the commercial world, on paper, handed to a private club. Their starting capital was a little over £68,000, a respectable sum, and utterly absurd against what it would become. The prize was spice, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, mace, grown on a handful of islands in what is now Indonesia, and worth many times their weight in silver by the time they reached a London table. A single successful voyage could pay for itself several times over. The problem was that a single unsuccessful voyage, and the route around the Cape killed ships routinely, could ruin every man who had backed it. The solution to that problem is the reason this video exists, and it is the company's first and greatest invention. Instead of one merchant risking one fortune on one ship, hundreds of investors each bought a small share of the whole venture. No single backer could be ruined. No single shipwreck could end the enterprise. At first, each voyage was a separate fund, subscribed, sailed, sold, and wound up, with the profits handed back. But winding up a trading empire every few years was madness, and in 1657, the company made the leap that changed everything: a permanent joint stock. The capital would never be handed back. If an investor wanted out, he did not ask the company for his money. He sold his share to someone else. Stop and look at what that means, because it is the DNA of the entire modern economy. A business that no longer depends on any particular investor, any particular ship, any particular man. The people die. The capital lives. Shares become things you trade rather than redeem, which means shares acquire a price, which means a market must exist to set it. The joint stock company with permanent capital is, quite simply, the invention of the immortal business. And immortality, it turns out, changes what a business can want. A merchant plans for his lifetime. A permanent corporation can plan for conquest. But conquest came later. First came humiliation, because the company lost the spice race badly. The Dutch had founded their own East India Company in 1602, capitalized at many times the English level, and the Dutch played rough. In 1623, on the island of Amboina, Dutch officials seized and executed 10 of the English company's merchants, and English power in the Spice Islands effectively died with them. In 1667, under the Treaty of Breda, England formally surrendered its claim to Run, a nutmeg island it had clung to for decades. As part of the same settlement, the Dutch let England keep a different island, one their rivals had seized in America a few years earlier, a place called Manhattan. At the time, most observers reckoned the Dutch had kept the better rock. So the English company, beaten in Indonesia, fell back on its second choice, India. And this is where it turns. India did not have spice islands. It had something better, the finest, cheapest textiles on earth. Calico, chintz, muslin, cottons woven to a quality Europe could not touch, at prices Europe could not believe. The company set up trading posts, a factory at Surat by 1613, Madras from 1639, Calcutta from 1690. Bombay it acquired by a route so English it hurts. The island came to King Charles II in 1661 as part of his Portuguese bride's dowry, and in 1668 he leased it to the company for £10 a year. Indian cotton conquered the English wardrobe so completely that Parliament, protecting the wool trade, banned printed calicos outright in the early 1700s. The company shrugged and pivoted its imports again to a Chinese leaf that would end up financing a fifth of this story, tea. And all the while, almost unnoticed, the company was acquiring the habits of a state. Its trading posts sat inside fortified walls because 17th century trade needed defending. Successive royal charters granted it the right to fortify, to mint coin, to raise troops, to exercise justice, and to make war and peace east of the Cape. Each power made commercial sense on the day it was granted. Nobody sat down and decided to create an armed sovereign corporation. It assembled itself, clause by reasonable clause, until, by the 1750s, the company kept small private armies of Indian soldiers, sepoys, drilled in European methods, guarding warehouses full of cloth. Hold that thought, a company with an army, because in 1756, it stopped being a curiosity. That June, the young new ruler of Bengal, the Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah, furious at the company's fortifications and its abuse of trading privileges, marched on Calcutta and took it in days. British prisoners died in a crowded cell in the aftermath, an episode inflated by propaganda at the time and disputed by historians ever since. And the trading company, faced with the loss of its richest trade, had to decide what it actually was. It decided it was a power. The man who made the decision had joined the company at 18 as a writer, the company's word for a junior clerk, a boy who copied invoices. His name was Robert Clive, and he had discovered in the company's small wars in southern India that he was a clerk with a talent for soldiering. In January 1757, he retook Calcutta. And then, instead of settling back into trade, he reached for something no company had ever done. What happened next is usually called the Battle of Plassey. It would be more honest to call it the purchase of Bengal. Bengal's great bankers, the house of the Jagat Seths, financiers to the Nawab's own government, had turned against Siraj-ud-Dawla, and with the company, they assembled a conspiracy. The Nawab's own army commander, Mir Jafar, would be installed in his place in exchange for staggering payments to the company and its servants. The battle itself, on the 23rd of June 1757, was almost a formality. Clive commanded around 3,000 men, most of them sepoys. Estimates put the Nawab's army at around 50,000, but a monsoon downpour soaked the Nawab's gunpowder while the company's gunners covered theirs, and Mir Jafar, commanding the largest part of the Nawab's force, simply stood and watched. By evening, the Nawab's army had dissolved. The company's casualties were counted in dozens. It was less a battle than a transaction with cannon attached, bought before it was fought. Then came the settlement, and the settlement is the point. The new Nawab, Mir Jafar, owed his throne to a corporation, and the corporation invoiced him for it. By the company's own accounts, well over £2 million flowed out of the Bengal treasury in compensation and gifts, much of it carried down the river to Calcutta in a flotilla of boats. Clive personally took around £234,000, plus a land revenue grant worth roughly £27,000 a year for life, making the former clerk one of the richest men in Britain in an afternoon. It is around this period that a Hindustani word for plunder began its migration into the English language, loot. But that was not the strangest part. The strangest part came 8 years later, in a tent. The company's new position in Bengal dragged it into more war, and in 1764, at Buxar, its sepoy army defeated a combined force that included the Mughal emperor himself, Shah Alam II. The emperor, a ruler with immense prestige and almost no power, then did something with no precedent in the history of either empires or commerce. On the 12th of August 1765, at Allahabad, in a ceremony conducted, by several contemporary accounts, in Clive's tent, with an armchair hoisted onto a dining table for a throne, Shah Alam granted the East India Company the diwani of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, the legal right to collect the land revenue of the richest provinces of India. Read that again, the way London's investors did. A corporation had acquired the taxes of some 20 million people, a revenue stream estimated at between £2 and £3 million a year, at a time when the entire tax revenue of Great Britain was around 10 million. And the machine the company built on top of it was elegant and extractive in equal measure. Bengal's taxes were used to buy Bengal's goods, which were shipped to London and sold at profit. The company called this its investment. Strip the accounting language away, and Bengal was now paying for its own export. Trade had become tribute with a ledger. London went mad for it. East India stock soared. The company raised its dividend to 12.5%. Returning company men, the papers called them nabobs from Nawab, came home with fortunes and bought country estates and seats in Parliament. The government, watching a private company swallow the revenues of provinces, extracted its cut the polite way. From 1767, the company agreed to pay the treasury £400,000 a year for the privilege of keeping its territories. Note the shape of that deal, because it will decide everything later. The state was now a paying stakeholder in the company's empire. The company's dividend and the nation's budget had been wired together. And within 5 years, that beautiful machine produced 2 catastrophes, one in Bengal, one in the ledgers of London. They are the same story, and the first one demands to be told with care. In 1769, the monsoon failed over Bengal. The rains failed, the rice crop failed, and through 1770 the province starved. The scale is genuinely uncertain, and honesty requires saying so. The company's own incoming governor, Warren Hastings, reported in 1772 an estimate that 1/3 of the population had perished, a figure most modern historians consider far too high. Serious modern estimates range from around 1 million deaths to several million. No one will ever know, because nobody in authority was counting. What the record does establish, coldly and clearly, is what the company did with its tax machine while its taxpayers died. The land revenue was not suspended. It was enforced, and by the company's own revenue accounts, collections for 1771 came in higher than they had been before the rains failed. Company servants were widely accused, then and since, of profiteering in grain as prices soared. The company had not caused the drought, but it had spent 5 years stripping the surplus out of Bengal, the stores, the reserves, the cushion a society keeps against a bad year. And when the bad year came, the revenue engine kept running. A government answers, eventually, for its famines. A corporation answers to its shareholders, and the shareholders were owed 12.5%. Now watch that dividend, because it is about to detonate in London. The truth was that the company's Bengal windfall had been oversold from the start. The costs of its army were devouring the revenue. The famine had gutted collections going forward, even as the 1771 arrears were squeezed in, and the 12.5% dividend was increasingly being paid not out of profit, but out of borrowing, a corporation maintaining its share price with debt while its underlying business bled. The stock had already lurched downward once in 1769, when news reached London that the company was at war again in southern India, and into that overstretched, over-leveraged, overconfident market walked a speculator. If you have watched this channel's story of the Industrial Revolution, you have met him, Alexander Fordyce, the London banker who gambled his bank's money against East India stock, lost and fled to France in June 1772, toppling his own bank, then the Air Bank of Scotland, then a swathe of smaller houses in the Great Credit Panic of 1772. We told that story from the side of the banks, and we said then that the panic reached the mighty East India Company, which had to be rescued by the government, a story we would tell elsewhere. This is that story, because from the company's side, the panic was not the disease. It was the tide going out, and it revealed that the corporation which owned Bengal could not pay its bills. In the summer of 1772, with credit frozen across Britain, the company faced customs duties it could not pay, loans from the Bank of England it could not roll over, and warehouses full of tea it could not sell. In August, the conqueror of Bengal went to the British government as a beggar. It asked for a loan on a scale no private business had ever requested from a state. And here is the turn that makes this the ancestor of every financial crisis you have lived through. Parliament could have let it fail. There were members who wanted exactly that, who called the company corrupt, overmighty and deserving of ruin. But then someone did the arithmetic of failure, and the arithmetic was terrifying. The company owed money across the whole city of London. Its collapse would fall on a banking system already on its knees. The treasury's 400,000 a year and the great flow of customs duty on company tea were built into the national budget. And behind everything stood the unthinkable strategic question: if the company fell, who exactly would be governing Bengal? The state had allowed a private company to become the load-bearing wall of both the public finances and the empire. It could not be allowed to collapse because everything was leaning on it. So, in 1773, Parliament lent the East India Company £1.4 million of public money. It was the first great state rescue of a private corporation, the original bailout. And every argument made in 2008 about banks was made in 1773 about the company, in almost the same words: outrage that reckless men were being saved from their own greed, and the weary answer that the alternative was worse. But Parliament had learned the other half of the lesson too, the half we are still relearning. If the public bears the risk, the public demands control. The price of the money was the Regulating Act of 1773, the first time the British state reached inside the company and rearranged it. A Governor-General for Bengal, Warren Hastings, with a council watching him. A Crown Court in Calcutta, the dividend capped while the loan was outstanding. Reforms to the company's own elections. Every modern bailout condition, the oversight board, the pay restraint, the statesman inside the boardroom, is a descendant of that act. Privatized profit had met socialized loss, and the state had discovered that saving a company entitles you to run it. And then there was the tea, £17 million weight of it, sitting unsold in the company's London warehouses, a mountain of stock at the heart of its cash crisis. Parliament's solution was the Tea Act of 1773. Let the company ship tea directly to the American colonies, cutting out the middlemen so cheap that it would undercut even the smugglers who supplied much of America's tea. From London, it looked like an elegant piece of corporate rescue. From Boston, it looked like something else entirely, a state-backed monopoly being dumped on the colonies, carrying with it the one tax Parliament had pointedly kept, a tax the colonists had never consented to. If the company's cheap tea was swallowed, the principle came with it. On the 16th of December 1773, Bostonians boarded the company's ships and threw 342 chests of its tea into the harbour. The company, being the company, valued the loss precisely, £9,659. Parliament answered with punishment, the colonies answered with congresses, and within 2.5 years the quarrel was a revolution. Follow the causal chain backwards, because it is one of the most remarkable in modern history. The American Revolution's spark was a tea shipment. The tea shipment was a bailout measure. The bailout was needed because a corporation with an army had gambled itself to the edge of ruin on the far side of the world. The rescue of the world's biggest company helped cost Britain America. You might think that would be the end of the experiment. Instead, the next 80 years became something slower and stranger. The state swallowing the company one bite at a time, nationalisation by installments. The reckoning began with the men. Clive was hauled before a parliamentary inquiry into Bengal, where, confronted with the fortune he had taken after Plassey, he protested that, considering the treasure that had lain open to him, he stood astonished at his own moderation. Parliament, remarkably, voted that he had rendered great services to his country. It did not save him. In November 1774, he died suddenly at his London house, by his own hand, according to most contemporaries. The record is not conclusive. A man who had won a province and never won an argument about how. Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General, was impeached in 1788 in Westminster Hall, with Edmund Burke leading the prosecution in one of the great political spectacles of the century. The trial dragged on for 7 years and ended in acquittal, but the trial itself was the point. For 7 years, the British state publicly examined what a corporation had done with sovereign power. It was, in everything but name, the first great corporate accountability hearing. The thinkers arrived at the same verdict from opposite directions. Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations in 1776, dissected the company as an absurdity of design. A monopoly trading company was bad at governing, and a governing body was bad at trade, and an entity attempting both would do each corruptly. Burke put it in a single phrase that has never been bettered. The company, he said, was a state in the disguise of a merchant, and Parliament kept acting on that verdict. Pitt's India Act of 1784 created a government board of control sitting above the company's directors. From now on, the merchant proposed, but the state disposed. And yet, here is the paradox of the whole era. Even as London tightened the leash, the animal kept growing. Under governors-general answerable to that board, the company's wars rolled across India, and its sepoy army swelled to the roughly 260,000 men of 1803, where this story began, a private force about twice the size of the British Army, conquering in the name of shareholders who never left London. Then the state took the next bite. In 1813, Parliament stripped the company of its monopoly on trade with India. In 1833, it went further and ended the company's commercial business altogether. No more trade at all, not so much as a chest of tea. Sit with the strangeness of that. The East India Company from 1833 was a company that sold nothing. It existed to govern India on the Crown's behalf, while its shareholders were paid a guaranteed dividend of 10.5%, a fixed return charged on the taxes of India for owning shares in a government. The disguise Burke described had been formalized. The merchant was gone. Only the state in costume remained. It took one more catastrophe to strip the costume off. In 1857, the company's own Bengal army rose against it. The spark was the new Enfield rifles' greased cartridges, which soldiers believed, with cause, offended both Hindu and Muslim religious law. The deeper fuel was decades of annexation, as the company swallowed Indian states under legal doctrines of its own devising, including the great kingdom of Awadh the year before. The rising began at Meerut in May 1857 and became a year of war across northern India, with terrible violence and terrible reprisals on both sides. A human catastrophe this channel will not reduce to spectacle. What matters for this story is the verdict London drew from it. The experiment was over. A corporation could no longer be trusted with the government of a fifth of humanity, not least because the corporation had needed the British state's army to survive its own. In 1858, the Government of India Act transferred everything, the territories, the treaties, the armies, the debts, from the company to the Crown. Queen Victoria's proclamation that November announced the change to India directly. The company that had been chartered to buy pepper had ended as the delivery mechanism by which Britain acquired an empire, and the state, having absorbed the asset, wound up the shell with an accountant's tidiness. The shareholders kept their guaranteed dividend until 1874, when the stock was finally redeemed and the East India Company was dissolved, not on a battlefield, but in a redemption schedule. Even the ending carried the company's signature. The cost of paying off its shareholders was charged to the revenues of India. The country paid to buy out the corporation that had owned it. So count what this one company left behind, because you are living in all of it. The permanent joint stock corporation, the immortal business, is the company's invention, and it is the legal form of essentially every large enterprise on Earth. The stock market grew up pricing its shares. The first great share manias and crashes ran through its stock. The agency problem, managers enriching themselves at the expense of owners and everyone else, was diagnosed on the company's servants before the phrase existed. The regulatory state was built piece by piece as a cage for it. The inquiry, the oversight board, the accountability trial, each one improvised in response to something the company had just done. And above all, 1772 established the precedent that has governed every systemic crisis since. Let an enterprise grow until the public finances lean on it, and it acquires a claim on the public purse that no free market principle can dislodge. Profits private, losses public, oversight afterwards. The whole modern script was written in a single decade, with a tea party for a closing scene. Which is why the company's story refuses to stay in the 18th century. Every time a bank is rescued because its failure would bring down the system, every time a corporation's revenues rival a state's budget and its decisions reach further than most governments, every time lawmakers summon executives to explain a power no one ever exactly voted to give them, we are rerunning the East India problem. What does a society do with a company that has outgrown the rules that made it? Britain's answer took 85 years, one lost continent, and a rebellion to complete, and it was the bluntest answer available. If a company becomes a state, the state takes it over. The machinery that replaced the company, the professional civil service, the accountable ministries, and behind everything a central bank learning, panic by panic, to stand behind the system, is machinery whose construction we have been tracing elsewhere on this channel, from the founding bargain of the Bank of England to the money machine that financed the factories. The East India Company is the dark twin of that story, proof of what the same instruments, joint stock, cheap credit, state charters, could build when they were pointed not at mills and canals, but at the revenues of a conquered province. The tools do not choose, the people holding them do. Sources for this account include the East India Company's founding charter of 1600 and its successor charters, the Parliamentary Select Committee reports on Bengal of the early